At that trial, when I lost everything, my daughter-in-law only whispered, "You are so pitiful." She did not know that a call from Switzerland was about to turn that pity into a $47 million fortune. Hello, dear listeners. I am Viviana. Today, the North Carolina sky where I live is a bit chilly, making me remember that freezing feeling in my heart on that day. Have you ever felt like you became invisible right in the very home you spent your whole youth building up? It is a sigh that sometimes we only know how to send into our prayers every night. Before I tell you about the fateful phone call that changed the life of this pitiful old woman, I really hope to receive a gentle touch on the like button from you. Or you can leave a greeting in the comments below so we can see that we are not alone in this life. Now, let us go back with me to that fateful morning in the old kitchen, where everything began to fall apart. That morning started with a dull ache in my knees, a lingering reminder of the dampness that never quite left my bones after Hurricane Helene tore through our part of North Carolina last year. I slowly eased my feet into my old Skechers, the ones with the extra support that helped me manage the walk to the kitchen. I spent nearly 2 hours over the stove, carefully preparing black bean soup and golden cornbread, the comfort food Amelia always loved, hoping a warm breakfast might soften the heavy air in this house ever since my son David first mentioned the word divorce. I carried that steaming bowl up to her room, limping slightly but heart full of hope, only to find her staring intently at those legal papers on the desk. When I spoke her name, she did not even look up from the page. With one sharp, sudden motion, she swiped the bowl right out of my hand, sending the hot liquid splashing across my thin, wrinkled skin. Her eyes were as cold as an Alaskan winter, watching me with total indifference as I stood there trembling and trying to clean the mess. The stinging on my skin was nothing compared to the sudden numbness spreading through my chest. Amelia stood up, the sharp click of her high heels hitting the hardwood floor I used to scrub on my hands and knees every single day. She looked at me and said I was outdated, that my soup was as cheap as my presence in this house. I stood there frozen, feeling the breath catch in my throat in the space that was supposed to be my sanctuary. David was standing right there in the doorway. He saw the red burn marks on my motherly hands, but he just turned his back and walked away without saying a word. That silence from my own son felt like the final thread of hope snapping inside me. My whole world, the one I built as a widow who gave every ounce of myself to this family, suddenly went dark and felt hauntingly empty. I stood there in the middle of my kitchen, surrounded by broken ceramic shards, realizing that decades of sacrifice had only earned me this contempt. But that was not even the end of it. Later that evening, when I was told to pack my things and move down to the dark, cramped basement room by Amelia's order, I finally began to look back at everything I had truly lost just to buy this silence. I sat on the edge of that old twin bed in the basement, where the smell of dust and dampness seemed to settle into my skin. The dim light from my bedside lamp caught the edges of the cardboard boxes that held the fragments of my entire life. The letters, the old photos, and the things that belonged to Robert, my late husband. I pulled out my old savings book, and as I flipped through the pages, the numbers stared back at me like a harsh indictment of my own foolishness. I had withdrawn $150,000 from my retirement fund and Robert's insurance money just so David could start his own architecture firm. Then I gave another $50,000 to renovate this house, the same house where I have now been exiled to the cellar, so Amelia can have a room for her yoga. Robert used to tell me to keep something for myself, to look out for my own future. But my love for my son made me blind. I gave it all away without keeping even a small piece for my own protection. Memories of when Amelia first joined the family came flooding back. She was so sweet then, always calling me Mother Moses and promising that she would take care of me in my old age. But sitting here in the dark, I finally see the pattern. She was only ever kind when she needed me to sign a check or when she wanted me to watch the house so she could go out and party. She slowly turned me into an unpaid servant, a ghost in my own hallways. She even managed to isolate me from my sisters at the church, telling them that I needed to rest because my memory was failing. Every time I tried to speak up or reclaim my voice, she would cleverly turn it around, making me feel like my very presence was a burden on David's marriage. The guilt she piled on me felt heavier than the house above my head. Tonight, in the heavy silence of the basement, I can hear them laughing and walking around upstairs. The sound of their footsteps on the ceiling feels like they are stepping right on my heart. I thought about her calling me outdated today, and the way she looked at the burn on my hand with such coldness. A naked, ugly truth finally came into focus. I am not a part of this family. I am just a tool that has been squeezed dry of its value. For the first time in years, a hot spark of anger flared up, burning away the sadness. I looked at the photograph of Robert on my nightstand, and his steady eyes seemed to give me the strength I have been missing. I whispered into the darkness, "Enough. Viviana, you are not going to wither away and die in this basement." The next morning, I did not wake up early to fix their breakfast. I lay there in the quiet, listening to Amelia's frantic footsteps above me and the sound of her shouting as she searched for her car keys. For the first time, I did not feel any urge to help or any worry for them. I got out of bed, put on my finest Sunday dress, and decided that today would be the first day I lived for myself. I stepped out of the house, just as the sun was beginning to peek through the old, majestic pine trees of North Carolina. The fresh air filling my lungs felt so invigorating, a world away from the stifling, damp air of that basement room. I drove my old car to Target, a place where I usually only went to pick up educational toys for the grandkids or things Amelia specifically asked for. Today, I stopped at the shoe section and chose a pair of Vionic shoes, something soft and supportive to pamper my aching feet that haven't been the same since the storm last year. After that, I slipped into Barnes & Noble, breathing in the scent of new paper and buying a novel I had wanted to read for ages, even though Amelia always called such things a waste of time. There was an indescribable joy in spending those few remaining dollars on myself for a change. I sat in a small cafe, sipping on a hot tea and watching the world go by outside the window. I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling a bit as I looked for Sarah's name, my best friend from the church women's group, whom I hadn't spoken to in over 6 months because of Amelia's constant control. When I heard Sarah's voice on the other end, I almost burst into tears. She told me the whole group missed me and had been praying for me, and that warm greeting was like a healing medicine for my soul. We made plans to grab lunch tomorrow, and I realized then that the outside world had always been waiting with open arms. I was the only one keeping myself locked in that cage of family obligation. In the afternoon, I returned home, but I didn't walk it through the back door meant for the help like I usually did. I walked right through the front door with my head held high. For the first time in years, a sense of peace settled over me, washing away the heavy burden I had been carrying. I went into the kitchen, brewed myself a cup of licorice tea, and sat down in the living room to read my new book. When Amelia came home from work and saw me sitting there, she froze, her eyebrows shooting up in pure shock. I just gave her a gentle smile, offering no explanation and feeling no fear. I felt stronger than ever, like a small plant finally reaching for the light after a long frozen winter. But that peace did not last long. Once Amelia realized I was no longer the compliant mother-in-law she could push around, she began to change her tactics. She saw that when I stopped doing all the housework, her perfect, organized life started to fall into chaos. And that was the moment the first real confrontation began. My dear sisters, have you ever felt like you just needed to escape the weight of family worries to find yourself again? Please tell me about the smallest gift you ever bought for yourself that made you truly happy. And do not forget to hit the like button to support me on this journey toward finding my freedom. That evening, the heavy silence of the basement was broken by a soft, rhythmic tapping on my door. It was a sound I had not heard in a long time, gentle and almost hesitant. When I opened it, there stood Amelia. She was not the cold, sharp woman from the kitchen that morning. Instead, she was wearing a soft sweater and holding a plate of warm chocolate chip cookies, the kind she knew were my favorite. Her voice was as sweet as Tupelo honey when she asked me how I was doing, calling me Mother Moses with a warmth that felt like a coat that no longer fit. She stepped into my small room, looking around with a forced sympathy that made my skin crawl. She sat on the edge of my bed and began to talk about how hard things had become for David's architecture firm. She spoke about the rising costs of everything, the new tariffs making business so difficult, and the way inflation was eating away at their savings. Then she lowered her voice, playing the role of the worried daughter-in-law, claiming they were just a little short on funds to cover my upcoming Medicare bill and some other household expenses. I sat in my chair, my hands resting in my lap, and watched her. I looked at those cookies and remembered the black bean soup dripping from my hands just hours before. The contrast between her fake sweetness now and her ice-cold cruelty then was almost physically painful. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a new kind of iron-willed steadiness rising up from my core. "I do not have any money, Amelia," I said. My voice was quiet, but it did not shake. I saw her face flicker for just a second, the mask of kindness slipping to reveal the confusion beneath. She quickly tried to recover, her eyes filling with performative tears as she began the old song I had heard so many times before. She told me we were a family, and that if David went bankrupt, we would all lose this house. She asked me if I really wanted to see my only son suffer, trying to wrap me in that old, heavy blanket of guilt she had used to smother my spirit for years. Amelia leaned forward, reaching out to pat my hand as if to comfort me, but I pulled back before her fingers could touch my skin. The air in the room felt thick with her desperation. I told her as clearly as I could that I had already given David everything I had to give, and now all I had left was this small bit of peace. At those words, the sweetness vanished instantly. Her face hardened, and her voice became a jagged edge as she called me selfish. She stood up and paced the small space, snapping that I was sitting there reading books while they were drowning in debt because of the choices I had made. I did not argue. I did not apologize. I simply stood up, walked to the door, and held it open for her. I told her I needed my rest and wished her a good night. The look of pure, unadulterated rage on her face as she marched out, leaving the plate of cookies behind, was something I will never forget. As the door clicked shut, I felt a surge of confidence like a current of electricity running through me. I did something then that I had never felt the need to do in this house before. I turned at the lock. The sound of that bolt sliding into place echoed through the basement, and instead of feeling lonely, I felt a profound sense of safety. The silence that followed was different now. It was mine. I knew Amelia would not let this go. She was like a predator that had just realized its prey was no longer submissive. But I was no longer the woman who would sit and take it. I sat down at my small desk, opened a notebook, and began to write. I listed every check I had signed, every retirement dollar I had handed over, and every insurance payment I had poured into David's dreams. I was documenting my life, preparing for a future where I would no longer be invisible. The peace of that evening was a warning, a quiet breath before the storm I knew was coming, especially when I thought about the spare key Amelia kept for this very door. The silence of the next few days was heavy, like the air before a North Carolina thunderstorm. Amelia did not speak to me, but I could feel her eyes on me whenever I went to the kitchen. It was a sign that she was shifting her tactics, moving from sweet words to something much darker. The breaking point came sooner than I expected, on a night when the moon was hidden by clouds and I was startled awake by the sound of my bedroom door swinging open in the middle of the night. The sound of the lock rattling in the middle of the night made me bolt upright in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My bedroom door, the only bit of privacy I had left in this basement, swung open with a violent thud against the wall. There stood Amelia, her silhouette framed by the dim hallway light, but the sweet Mother Moses mask she had worn earlier was gone. I could smell the sharp, sour scent of wine on her breath from across the room, and her eyes were bloodshot and wild with a rage I had never seen so clearly before. Without a word, she marched toward my bed and threw a thick stack of papers and unpaid bills right at my face. She began to scream, asking me who I thought I was to refuse her, her voice echoing off the cold basement walls. She started tearing through my things, throwing my books and my precious keepsakes onto the floor as if they were trash. When she reached for the small wooden box that held Robert's things, a primal fear washed over me, and I tried to scramble out of bed to stop her. As I reached out to grab her arm, Amelia didn't hesitate. She gave me a hard, cruel shove that sent me flying backward onto the mattress. The impact jolted my spine, and a sharp, white-hot pain flared up through my lower back, a reminder of every heavy load I had ever carried and the lingering ache from the dampness of the storm season. I lay there for a second, gasping for air. And in that moment of physical pain, something inside me finally snapped. The years of being quiet, the months of being a ghost, and the decades of putting everyone else first evaporated into a cloud of pure, righteous fury. I forced myself to stand up, my legs shaking, but my spirit standing taller than it had in a long time. I shouted at her to stop, my voice ringing out with a power that seemed to startle even her. I stood directly in her path, my eyes locked onto hers, and I asked her if this was really what it had come down to, tearing through an old woman's room for a few extra dollars. I started listing every sacrifice I had made, from the $200,000 I had poured into David's life to the way I had let her treat me like a servant in my own home. Amelia just threw her head back and laughed, a cold, jagged sound that made my skin crawl. She called me a senile old woman who was nothing but a parasite living off their hard work. She stepped into my personal space, her face inches from mine, and hissed that this house and every penny in it would be hers eventually anyway. She told me that if I didn't start being useful and hand over the money she knew I was hiding, she would find the cheapest, most miserable nursing home in the state and dump me there by morning. She threatened to take away my books, my peace, and the very air I breathed, if it meant she could get what she wanted. It was the clearest I had ever seen her soul, and it was a hollow, greedy thing that felt entirely alien to the family I thought I was building. The realization that she had been planning this for a long time hit me like a physical blow, stripping away any last bit of illusion I held about our relationship. I didn't feel fear anymore, only a deep, bone-weary disgust that made me want to scrub my skin clean. I pointed my finger toward the open door and told her to get out of my room immediately. I told her that if she didn't leave right then, I would call the police and report her for trespassing and assault, and I meant every word of it. The look of absolute conviction in my eyes must have reached her through the fog of the alcohol, because she actually took a step back. She gathered her dignity like a tattered robe and stomped toward the door, but she couldn't help but throw one last threat over her shoulder. She told me I would regret this, that David would always choose her, and that I would end up on the street with nothing left to my name. The door slammed so hard the walls trembled, leaving me alone in the wreckage of my room. I sank down onto the floor, my strength leaving me all at once. My hands were trembling as I reached out to pick up the framed photo of Robert that had been knocked off the nightstand. The glass was cracked right across his face, and seeing his smile splintered like that made the tears finally spill over. But they weren't the tears of a victim. They were the tears of a woman who was finally washing away the grime of a life she no longer recognized. I knew I couldn't stay in this house for another hour, let alone another night. I spent the rest of the dark hours packing the few things that truly mattered into one small suitcase: my Bible, my journals, and the few mementos of a life lived with honor. I was exhausted, every bone in my body screaming for rest, but there was a fire in my belly that kept me moving. Just before the first light of dawn began to gray the North Carolina sky, I walked up those basement stairs for the last time. I didn't look toward David and Amelia's room, and I didn't stop to imagine their faces when they woke up. I placed my house keys on the kitchen table, right next to a small scrap of paper where I had written only 3 words: "It is enough." I walked out the front door and felt the bite of the morning air against my face. And for the first time in years, it felt like I could actually breathe. I didn't know exactly where the road would take me, but I knew I would never be a ghost in my own home again. I climbed into my car, my Vionic shoes steady on the pedals, and began driving toward the address of the lawyer Sarah had told me about. The betrayal had cut the final cord, but in doing so, it had set me free to find the justice I deserved. I am leaving that life behind, but I am not running away. I am walking toward a version of myself that refuses to be silenced or stolen from any longer. I am heading toward a place where my name is respected, and my history is not a weapon to be used against me. To every woman listening who feels like they are being pushed into a corner of their own life, please hear me when I say that you have the right to walk out into the light. It is a long road to reclaim what was taken, but every step is worth the cost of your soul. That morning, I sat in the quiet office of a lawyer Sarah had recommended, someone who specialized in the rights of seniors and knew exactly how to navigate the complicated waters I was currently drowning in. The air in the room was still and smelled of old paper and freshly brewed coffee, a scent that somehow helped my mind feel clearer than it had in years. I sat across from him and laid out everything, explaining how Amelia had used David to slowly take control of my life, my money, and even my sense of reality. I told him about the threats she made to put me in a nursing home and how she had been using the power of attorney I signed years ago as a leash. He listened with a kind of deep empathy that made me feel seen, not as a burden, but as a woman whose rights had been trampled. He advised me right then and there to revoke every legal authority I had ever granted them. For the first time since Robert passed, I did not feel like a child being led around. I felt like a grown woman taking the wheel of her own life again. The next step was to secure what was left of my hard-earned savings. I went to the local bank branch where the tellers had known me for decades, back when I used to bring David in as a little boy. I sat down with a woman who looked to be about my age, someone who understood the weight of a life lived through hard work. I requested to open a completely new account, one that was mine and mine alone, with no connection to the names of those who had betrayed me. I moved what was left of my retirement funds and Robert's insurance money into that safe harbor. With the economic changes of 2025 making every dollar feel more precious, I knew I could not afford to let any more of it slip through my fingers. I also filled out the paperwork to change my mailing address for my Medicare and Social Security statements. I wanted to make sure that no more of my personal business would ever end up in Amelia's hands again. After finishing at the bank, I went back to the small apartment Sarah had helped me find, a place that was humble but filled with a peace that David's house had lost long ago. I had already arranged for a locksmith to meet me there. Hearing the rhythmic metallic clicking as he replaced every single lock was like music to my ears. Each new key he handed me felt like a badge of honor, a tangible symbol of my new boundaries. I also had him help me install a small, discreet security camera above the door that I could monitor right from my phone. I was determined that I would never again be startled awake in the middle of the night by someone who thought they had the right to invade my space. That afternoon, I headed to the local community center, a place where I usually went for social gatherings, but was now a place for my tactical digital defense. A young volunteer there, a patient boy who reminded me of how David used to be, helped me navigate the confusing world of digital security. Together, we went through every one of my accounts, my email, my social media, and my banking apps, and changed every single password to something only I would know. I went through my contact list and took the final painful step of blocking Amelia's number and her social media profiles. Every time I pressed that block button, it felt like I was untangling a thorny vine that had been wrapping tighter and tighter around my soul. I was cutting the digital ties that had allowed her to whisper her poison into my ear even when I wasn't in the same room. To make sure my defense was truly solid, I spent the rest of the day contacting the utility companies. I called the electric, water, and internet providers to ensure that my name was the only one on the contracts for my new place. I had spent too many months being threatened with unpaid bills and the fear of having my services cut off as a form of punishment. I was making sure that the basics of my life were under my own control, so that no one could ever use the roof over my head or the light in my room as a weapon against me again. Setting these physical and financial boundaries was giving me the mental strength I needed to face whatever emotional storms were still to come. By the end of the day, as the sun began to set over the North Carolina pines, I sat in my new safe room and looked at the list of everything I had accomplished. My body felt the weight of the day's work, but my mind was lighter than it had been in years. I knew the journey to reclaim my dignity was far from over, but the foundation I had built today was made of solid rock. I brewed myself a cup of herbal tea and just sat there, listening to the true sound of silence, a silence that did not feel like isolation, but like the beautiful, wide-open space of my own freedom. Building this system of protection was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was the only way to save myself. I had to learn that my kindness was not a weakness, but it needed a fence around it to keep the wolves out. I am finally standing on my own 2 feet, and even though the ground is still a bit shaky, it is my ground. I can breathe again, and for the first time in a very long time, I am looking forward to seeing what tomorrow brings. That afternoon, as I was carefully arranging a few small flower pots by my new window, there was a gentle knock at the door. It was Mrs. Miller, the neighbor who lives right across from my new little place. She was carrying a tray of warm, fresh-baked goods and told me she had heard the locksmith working earlier and guessed someone new had finally moved in. We sat together on the porch, and somehow, under the soft glow of the evening sky in Georgia, I found myself opening up and sharing a part of my story. Mrs. Miller reached out and squeezed my hand tight. her eyes filled with a deep, knowing empathy as she told me that I was not alone and that in this community, they look out for one another. The next morning, Sarah came by with a group of sisters from our church women's circle. They didn't come empty-handed. They brought enough food to feed an army, along with their laughter and their most sincere prayers. Sarah sat me down and looked me right in the eye, promising that she was ready to stand up and testify about every time she saw Amelia treat me poorly if things ever had to go to court. Looking at those familiar, trustworthy faces, the heavy fear of being judged or seen as a failed mother simply melted away. I realized then that the truth is a powerful thing that spreads, and I finally felt like I had a whole army standing right behind me. Having these allies by my side didn't just give me spiritual strength, it began to restore my faith in people again. I didn't feel the need to be shy or hide my eyes when I walked down the street anymore. Instead, I started going back to the community center and even joined the senior yoga class, the very thing Amelia used to mock me for. Every smile and every kind word from my friends felt like a sturdy brick being laid to build a wall of protection around my heart, keeping out the hurt that Amelia had caused. In that newfound peace, I decided it was time to finally go through the boxes of Robert's things I had brought from the old house. I only meant to find a few old photographs to help with the loneliness, but I never expected what happened next. Deep down at the very bottom of an old wooden chest, I found a truth that was about to shake the very foundation of Amelia's schemes. My dear sisters, in your hardest moments, have you ever received unexpected help from a stranger or an old friend? How much did that warmth mean to you? Please share your stories in the comments so we can keep spreading hope together. And don't forget to hit the like button if you believe that kindness always finds a way to win. The small room was filled with warm North Carolina sunlight as I pulled Robert's old wooden chest toward me. I thought I knew every insurance paper and tax document inside that box. But as I reached down and lifted the frayed red velvet lining at the very bottom, I felt the crisp edge of a folder that shouldn't have been there. Inside was a collection of printed emails and messages Amelia had sent to a friend nearly 3 years ago, all meticulously saved by Robert. My blood ran cold as I read her words, stripped of any sweetness or mercy. She wrote that once this old woman signs the full power of attorney, the house and the retirement funds will be in our pockets, and they just needed to keep me thinking they were actually caring for me. It was a calculated betrayal that started long before she ever began huffing at my presence in the kitchen. I kept reading, my hands trembling as I turned the pages of draft wills Amelia had prepared in secret. She had written me out of everything, ensuring that in the event something happened to David, every asset would fall directly into her hands. Every sweet word of Mother Moses and every fake smile during Sunday dinners had been a performance in a long play designed to strip me of my security and my future. The pain of this betrayal was sharp, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, brutal clarity that swept away every excuse I had made for her behavior. I finally understood that she did not just want my money. She wanted to erase my autonomy and steal the very foundation of my life. Between the documents, I found a small yellowed slip of paper with Robert's familiar, steady handwriting, though it looked a bit shaky toward the end. He wrote to me saying, "Viviana, I know you always see the world through a lens of kindness, but if there comes a day when I am not there to shield you, use these papers to protect yourself." He told me never to let my goodness become a weapon used against me by the greedy. Robert had seen her true nature years ago and had chosen to stay quiet to keep my heart from breaking while he was still alive. But he had left me this shield to guard my dignity when I needed it most. A wave of physical disgust rose in my throat as I realized I had been sharing a home with a predator for all this time. I began to see her small acts of cruelty differently. The way she would move my walker just out of reach, or how she would belittle me when neighbors were around. It was all part of a plan to make me feel mentally unstable and small enough to control. I sat there in the silence and used my phone to take clear photos of every single page, sending them directly to my lawyer's secure email. These were not just papers anymore. They were the absolute proof I needed to unmask her and protect the legacy Robert worked his whole life to build. The truth felt like a sudden storm that had washed away the last of my illusions about having a peaceful family home with them. But as the air cleared, I no longer felt the heavy weight of guilt for leaving or for refusing to hand over my savings. I knew now that I was carrying out Robert's final wish by standing up for myself and our family name. I folded the documents back into the folder, my heart beating with a new, powerful rhythm of awakening and resolve. I owed Robert a debt of gratitude for looking out for me even from the other side, and I felt a desperate need to find a quiet place that still held his spirit before I took the next big step in this fight for my life. I took a moment to just sit there, feeling the weight of the folder in my lap and the strength of the truth in my soul. I was no longer the pitiful old woman Amelia thought she could discard. I was a woman with the truth on her side and a community behind her. I knew the path ahead would be difficult, but I was ready to walk it with my head held high. I spent the rest of the evening making sure my digital locks were tight and preparing my mind for the confrontation that I knew would come once these documents were brought to light in the courtroom. The storm was coming, but I was no longer afraid of the rain. I drove to the cemetery on a quiet afternoon, the sky draped in the soft golden light that filters through the ancient oak trees of North Carolina. Standing before Robert's grave, the gentle scent of freshly cut grass and sweet magnolia blossoms seemed to wrap around me like a familiar embrace. I sat down on the cool stone bench nearby, resting my hand on the smooth, cold granite of his headstone, feeling a deep sense of connection that transcended the silence. "Robert," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. "I found the box you left for me." In that stillness, I sat with the memories of everything he taught me about the honor and resilience of our people, and how we had navigated through so many seasons of struggle to build the life we had. The memories began to play back like a slow, beautiful film in my mind. I saw Robert clearly, working diligently at the post office every single day, his hands weary, but his heart fixed on the future. I remembered how he cherished every dollar we saved, how proud he was the day we signed the papers for our very first home. He used to look at me and say, "Viviana, wealth can be lost in the blink of an eye, but no one is ever allowed to strip you of your voice." In that moment, I felt his love as a warm wave of protection washing over the fatigue in my bones. I was no longer exhausted. Instead, I felt an iron will being forged from the very roots of my history and the sacrifices of those who came before me. I stood up and adjusted my scarf, my eyes fixed on the horizon with a clarity I had not felt in years. That internal conversation with Robert helped me understand that standing up for myself was not an act of selfishness. It was an act of sacred duty to protect his life's work and the dignity of the woman he loved. I made a silent promise to him that I would not let Amelia tarnish our family's legacy ever again. As I walked away from the cemetery, I moved with the poise and steady grace of a woman who had finally found her path. But I knew the storm was far from over. Amelia had realized her old tricks were no longer working, and she was preparing to escalate her tactics by attacking my very sanity and health, trying to bring the weight of the authorities down on me. It was a crisp Tuesday morning, and I was just about to head out for my daily walk to keep my joints moving. a habit I started right after the storms last year to manage my health. As I reached for my light jacket, a sharp knock at the door made me pause. Standing there was a middle-aged woman with a stern expression and a clipboard in her hand. She introduced herself as an investigator from Adult Protective Services, or APS. She looked me straight in the eye and told me they had received a formal report claiming I was showing signs of severe dementia and was no longer capable of caring for myself. My heart did a slow, painful somersault in my chest. A cold wave of outrage washed over me as I realized exactly what Amelia had done. She was trying to weaponize the law to strip me of my freedom and force me into a guardianship. I took a long, steady breath and invited her inside, making sure to keep my hands from shaking. The first thing I did was pick up my phone and call my lawyer, putting him on speakerphone so every word would be part of the record. My lawyer calmly reminded the social worker that, while I was happy to cooperate, every part of this interview had to follow the proper legal procedures. I sat down at my small table and opened my tablet, showing the investigator my digital records. I walked her through my daily spending logs and showed her the digital receipts from my trips to Costco and Target, where I still do all my own shopping. I showed her my regular schedule at the community center, proving that I was an active, engaged member of my neighborhood, not some invisible ghost losing her grip on reality. The social worker then began the formal part of her visit, asking me orientation and memory questions to test my mental clarity. I answered every single one of them with a steady, clear voice. We talked about the recent extreme weather events that had been hitting the South and the specific changes to the 2025 Medicare policies that I had been keeping up with to manage my own care. I even pulled out the folder containing my most recent health checkup from my primary care physician, which showed I was in good health for a woman of my years. I could see the surprise on her face as she realized that the woman sitting in front of her was the complete opposite of the confused, unstable person Amelia had described in her report. The tension in the room peaked when the investigator mentioned that the person who filed the report had suggested a specific psychiatrist to perform a mental health evaluation on me. I felt a cold smile touch my lips. I looked her directly in the eye and told her that I absolutely refused to see any doctor handpicked by the very person trying to take my rights away. I stated clearly that if an evaluation was deemed necessary, I demanded an independent expert chosen by the court or the APS agency itself. I knew right then that Amelia had likely tried to find someone she could influence to help her steal my autonomy, but my knowledge of my own rights was backed by a strength she never expected me to find. To settle the matter once and for all, I pulled out the copies of the emails and messages I had found in Robert's old wooden box. I watched the investigator's face as she read Amelia's own words, detailing her cold plans to manipulate and isolate me for financial gain. The investigator's expression shifted from professional neutrality to deep concern. She began writing rapidly in her notebook, noting that there were now clear signs of intentional emotional and financial abuse coming from the person who had filed the report against me. In that moment, the tables had turned. I was no longer the subject of an investigation. I was the victim of a calculated attack, and Amelia was the one standing in the light of justice. As the social worker got up to leave, her entire demeanor had softened. She looked at me with a small, respectful nod and apologized for the intrusion, telling me that I was doing an excellent job of protecting myself. After I closed the door behind her, I leaned against it and felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. This violation of my privacy had been terrifying, but it had also resulted in a formal legal record of my sanity and my strength. I looked in the hallway mirror and saw a version of Viviana that was unbowed and resilient, a woman who would never let anyone cross the boundaries of her self-respect again. Amelia's cruel plan had failed, but I knew her greed wouldn't let her stop there. Since she couldn't prove I was unfit, she decided to play her final card and file a formal lawsuit to gain control over the assets she believed I was hiding from her. The final battle in the courtroom was now standing right on my doorstep. My dear sisters, our mental health and our right to make our own choices are the most precious things we have as we get older. Have you ever felt like people were trying to ignore your voice just because of the years you've lived? Please leave a comment so we can encourage each other to keep standing tall. And don't forget to hit the like button to support me as I head toward this final trial. Early that morning, a thick envelope arrived at my door, the red seal of the court looking official and cold against the morning light. Amelia had officially filed her lawsuit, asking the court for guardianship and full control over every asset I owned, claiming that I had lost my mental capacity and was no longer fit to manage my own life. I held that paper in my hand, and for a moment, I could feel a familiar chill of anxiety trying to work its way into my muscles. But then, I felt something else, something stronger. My breathing stayed steady and slow. I remembered the things we talked about in our church meetings, about how we shouldn't be afraid of people who try to use lies as their only weapon. I reached for the phone and called my lawyer, and as I spoke, my voice sounded firm and clear, echoing with a strength I had not known I had. We had been preparing for this day for a long time, and I knew it was finally time for the truth to be laid out for the world to see. Suddenly, Amelia's legal team sent over a last-minute offer for a settlement. They wanted me to sign a document agreeing to a small monthly allowance and a spot in a high-end care facility, provided I handed over all my assets and withdrew every claim of abuse I had made against them. As I read through those dry legal words, I could see the bitter contempt Amelia still held for me. She still looked at me as a timid woman who could be bought off with a little bit of comfort and the promise of a quiet life. I just smiled to myself, a smile of real freedom, and told my lawyer to give them a very short answer. I told them there would be no compromise when it came to my dignity or my truth. On the night before the trial, I sat down with Sarah and my lawyer to look over our evidence one last time. We talked about the economic pressures everyone is feeling right now, especially the high cost of living that is making life so hard for people my age. We discussed the peak 65 wave in 2025 and how millions of us are worried about our financial security and our Medicare benefits. In a world where inflation is making everything so uncertain, the fact that Amelia tried to cut me off from my own resources felt like more than just personal cruelty. It felt like a crime against my survival. Every document we placed in our folder felt like a solid step out of the shadows and toward the light. The air in my small room became very quiet and heavy with purpose as the night went on. I took the time to pray, and I found a deep, quiet peace in my heart. I did not feel like a victim who had been pushed into a corner by dirty tricks anymore. Instead, I felt like the strong, resilient women of the Moses family who had survived through so much by relying on their faith and their self-respect. I picked out my best outfit for the next morning, an elegant navy blue suit and the most comfortable shoes I had. I was ready to stand before the judge and tell my story with all the poise and honesty I could muster. I looked at myself in the mirror and realized that the lines on my face were not just marks of worry anymore. They were the map of a life that had been lived fully. I knew that the call from the Swiss bank and the $47 million fortune Robert had left behind were just tools for me to find justice, not the reason I was standing up to fight. What I truly wanted was for the truth to be known, and for the freedom Amelia tried to steal from me to be restored. That night, I fell into a deep and heavy sleep, and for the first time in a long time, there were no nightmares of that dark basement room. The morning sun came through my window, and I felt a sense of calm readiness that I had never known. I knew that the doors to the courtroom would be opening soon. It was not a place of fear for me anymore, but a place where I would finally reclaim the voice that had been silenced for so long. All the tension of this long journey was about to be released under the judge's gavel. I am Viviana, and I am finally ready to step into the light. The courtroom in North Carolina was filled with a heavy, expectant silence that morning, as the golden sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. I sat at the small table beside my lawyer, feeling the weight of the navy blue fabric of my suit against my skin, a reminder of the dignity I was here to reclaim. Across the aisle, Amelia sat with her head bowed slightly, wearing a modest lavender dress and a strand of soft pearls, performing the role of the grieving devoted daughter-in-law for the judge. When her lawyer stood up, his voice was smooth and practiced, like a salesman pitching a product no one wanted. He spoke about my supposed confusion and my inability to manage my own affairs, painting a picture of a woman who was losing her grip on reality. He brought up my shopping trips to Target and Costco, as if buying a new pair of shoes or stocking my own pantry were signs of a failing mind. I sat there in the quiet and let his words drift past me like dry leaves in the wind, because I knew the truth was tucked safely in the folder right in front of me. When it was finally our turn, my lawyer did not start with loud accusations or grand gestures. He spoke with a calm, steady rhythm that seemed to settle the restless energy in the room. He began by presenting the digital records of my daily life, the receipts that proved I was a woman who navigated the world with precision and care. But the air in the room truly changed when he activated the projector for our secret weapon. On the large screen for everyone to see were the emails and messages Amelia had sent years ago, the ones Robert had carefully preserved and hidden under the red velvet lining of his old wooden chest. There, in bright cold light, were her plans to manipulate me and isolate me to gain control of the house and the retirement funds. The room erupted in a low murmur, and I saw Amelia go a ghostly shade of pale, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the mahogany table. The judge looked toward me and asked if I wished to give my own testimony. I stood up and walked to the stand, my bionic shoes steady and silent on the floor. I took a deep breath and looked directly at the judge, feeling the strength of every woman in my family line standing there with me. I did not speak about the money or the legal filings. I spoke about the freezing silence of that basement room, and the way it felt to be made a stranger in the very house I had spent 40 years building with my own sweat and tears. I spoke with the voice of a mother who had given every ounce of her heart, only to have that kindness treated like a weakness to be exploited. I told her I was not there seeking pity or charity, but I was there to demand the right to own my own life and my own future until the day the Lord calls me home. Amelia's lawyer tried to push back one last time, questioning how a woman in her right mind could be unaware of a $47 million fortune sitting in a Swiss bank account. He tried to claim that my lack of knowledge about Robert's legacy was proof that I was mentally unfit to handle such wealth. But my lawyer was ready for him. He produced the final letter from the Swiss bank officials, the one where Robert had explicitly stated that the funds were only to be released when I was officially and legally no longer dependent on my children for my care. It proved that Robert had seen the growing shadows of their greed long before he passed, and that he had built this fortress to protect me. My silence all those months was a choice of love and a hope for my son's character, not a sign of a failing mind. That revelation hit the courtroom like a sudden thunderclap, silencing every lie they had tried to tell. I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of the judge's gavel, a sound that echoed through my soul like the closing of a dark chapter. She spoke with a sharp clarity as she dismissed the lawsuit entirely and issued a stern rebuke to Amelia for her pattern of emotional and financial manipulation. The court formally recognized my full autonomy and my right to manage my own life without interference. The judge also ordered that Amelia must vacate the house within 30 days because that home was purchased with the life's work of Robert and myself, and it belonged to me alone. In that moment, I felt a crushing weight simply evaporate from my shoulders. Justice had been served not through anger or a desire for revenge, but through the quiet and unstoppable power of the truth. As I walked out of that courtroom, the air felt lighter and the world seemed to hold more color than it had in years. Amelia tried to catch my eye, her face now twisted into a desperate fake mask of regret as she began to whisper and beg for financial mercy. I looked at her one last time, feeling nothing but a profound sense of peace. I told her as gently as I could that kindness was never something to be bartered, and that my dignity was not hers to take or give back. I turned away from her shadow and walked toward the hallway where Sarah and the sisters from the church were waiting for me with open arms and warm hugs. I took a deep, clear breath of the afternoon air, knowing that, for the first time in a very long time, my life and my voice were truly my own again. A full year has passed since the day that trial ended, and my life truly began. I decided I could not stay in that old house with all its heavy memories, so I sold it and moved into a beautiful little cottage near the North Carolina coast, where I can watch the sunset melt into the water every single evening. I did not use the fortune Robert left me for a life of empty luxury. Instead, I used the heart of it to establish a legal aid fund for seniors who are facing the same kind of abuse I once did. People who might not have a secret wooden box to save them. These days, I spend my time traveling on cruises through the Baltic Sea, tending to the bright flowers in my garden, and enjoying the yoga classes that I once thought were out of my reach. To my dear sisters who are listening to my voice, I want to leave you with this one truth. Your dignity is a priceless gift, and no one is ever allowed to wear it down just because they are family or because they think you are dependent on them. Be brave enough to draw a line in the sand, listen to your own spirit, and never let your goodness be turned into a chain that holds you back. This life is still so very beautiful, and it is overflowing with new beginnings. But you have to love yourself enough to step out of the dark and into the sun. I wish you all a deep and lasting peace, and I hope you find a way to make your own life feel whole again, one beautiful moment at a time. Thank you for sharing this time with me. It means so much to have you here. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with a sister who needs to hear it. We are never alone when we stand together. Stay strong, keep your light shining, and stay blessed until next time.